All right, all right, all right. We are live. MythVision podcast. How you doing out there? I hope you're all right. Dr. Justin Sledge, the if you will, owner of the YouTube channel Esoterica, is joining me today. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, Derek. It's great to be on. Fan of your work, and so it's really great for us to cross paths and do some work together. So I'm super excited about.
I am as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really great.
Every one of your videos, every single one of them are well done, I must
Appreciate
say.
that.
Yeah, you've
Appreciate
put a
that.
lot of good work into it. So let's get started. Let's draw a little blood.
Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Dr. Justin Sledge. I titled this thing Ancient Magic, Mysticism. You know, how do you pin something down? We might go all over the place depending on our audience, what they would like to hear and things. But thanks a lot. Tell us about what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So I'm the host of Esoterica. I mean, owner is a funny word because I feel like YouTube kind of owns us. But I at least I run the channel. But so I'm an academic. I focus on what is generally called like Western esotericism, which would broadly be construed as things like magic, mysticism, the occult, alchemy, Kabbalah. It's sort of the academic study of those topics that are either suppressed or repressed in Western history. I covered some ancient Near East stuff too. I have some interest in Bible and ancient Near East. But yeah, you can see from the thing there, for instance, today we released an episode on Paracelsus, the 16th century alchemist and alleged sorcerer, although I don't think he was actually involved in sorcery. But so we cover a wide range of things in esotericism, from biblical esotericism all the way up to the Middle Ages and into modernity. So we cover a bunch of stuff that way, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, I really love this material just because it's so completely weird. It can go from the Rephaim and the Nephilim all the way to magic cloaks and the Kabbalah, to turning lead to gold, to talking to angels in the 16th century. There's a huge range of stuff that we work on Esoterica, and so it's a ton of fun. And yeah, looking forward to hanging out and taking some questions. And folks are interested in esotericism, make sure to check our channel out, and make sure to subscribe. And it's a lot of fun. So if you're interested in strange things like magic and the occult, from an academic point of view, right, not from some like Looney Tunes rando weirdo. Not that I'm not weird, but I'm academically weird. So if you want it from from good legit sources and not just some crazy person spewing off stuff, make sure to check out Esoterica.
Yeah, you are legit. And yes, there are very weird stuff discussed on this channel, but it's so much fun. There's a lot of weird stuff that I find highly educational.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching this morning your #1 viewed video. I think, do you have your most viewed video in the front as a playlist? No, it's
sure.
the one on Solomon.
Yeah, it's up there. Yeah, I think it's
there
popular
it
uploads. Yeah, on the Lesser Key of Solomon. Yeah, that one's a lot of fun to make. All the mythology around Solomon and him summoning demons and using demons to build the first temple, allegedly, which is just one of the more fantastic stories in the Babylonian Talmud. So I really love that stuff. Solomon's just perennially interesting in his demonology, and that the idea of him being having control over demons goes all the way back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we even have some fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls that mention using a specific psalm as a mode of exorcism by Solomon. So that's a really, really, really ancient mythology.
Yeah, you don't take it to the surface. You definitely go down in depth and find sources. Also, I posted on the Patreon. If you're a supporter of MythVision, you got notified this morning. We're going to talk about, I just titled it Ancient Magic and Mysticism. We might get into the Kabbalah. We might talk about, you name it. We were talking about Honi, the circle drawer, that Jesus is sandwiched between these other magical figures in history. I have a lot of other work. Carl A.P. Ruck We just did one on the origins of the Eucharist, or the ideas that it comes from the pagan world. He's pretty blunt in his positions on what he thinks. Also, origins of Yahweh. I mean, we hear origins of like El, like these ideas, but Yahweh is a very complicated subject. And this guy spends 2 hours. Yako Garik spends hours explaining, and when you get done, you're like, wow, it's not simple. So anyway, we work very hard. He also has a Patreon as well, so you can support Justin in his hard work. And trust me, I know that it's a lot of hard work. Those edits are fantastic and the content is amazing. So enough plugging. Maybe we can have some fun.
Yeah, let's talk about some strange stuff. Yeah, you know, Derek, there's only one institution in the world that even grants an academic degree in this kind of stuff. It's the University of Amsterdam. So I studied there, and it was a lot of fun being in Amsterdam and learning, you know, this strange stuff. So the content really is unique in a lot of ways, because there are just so few places in the world where you can even get a degree in this material. So I really was glad to do that study and now make this information widely available to folks on YouTube. So
before I jump into the super chats, because we already have people who are throwing out some questions and showing some love, I'd like to ask you, how common is your field of expertise to be a PhD in and to do what you do? How common is that?
It is very uncommon. I would, like I said, there's only one degree granting institution in the world. That's the University of Amsterdam. They have an entire program dedicated to the history of Western esotericism. That's it. Now, there are some up-and-coming places. Rice has a little bit of that material, especially around Gnosticism. I think the University of Stockholm is kind of an emerging center as well, but it is very rare. And that's basically the reason why there's just my YouTube channel in sense of online content. There's a couple other folks doing some things as well, but yeah, it's super rare. And it's so rare that there are many cases where if I want to make an episode about something, for instance, this episode I did on Paracelsus this week, there just might not be modern editions of the books I'm covering. And so I'm literally picking up, you know, this is a 16th century book, you know, so I'm having to pick up 16th century editions, either in like actually a 16th century book, which can talk, it's a cool little book, or I'm using archive.org and Google Books, which scan these books in. And so I'm working directly with Latin, directly with, you know, with these texts in the original language.
Wow.
So it's very uncommon.
It's very absolutely uncommon. Yeah, no, that's why I really enjoyed watching your channel. I thought, man, every time I've looked into some of this material, it's usually by someone who literally ontologically believes in this, or there's a conspiracy theory that they're spinning. It's never like, here are the facts, this is data, this is it, without that bias of like, you know, the angel of Solomon came to me last night. I think he was whispering in my ear, like, okay, you know.
No, it's, yeah, you know, and again, I think that religious people can do religious scholarship really well, and I think secular people can do religious scholarship really poorly. Those two things don't imply one another. But yeah, I think that I agree with you. Part of the reason why I started the channel is that I looked on YouTube about some of the content about this stuff, and it was either, like you said, just conspiracy theory stuff, that underneath a lot of that conspiracy theory stuff is just the most terrifying kind of like gross racist, you know, Nazism stuff. It's just really bad. Or it's, like you said, people saying, yeah, I believe this because an angel told me it's true, as opposed to, let's actually just look at their historical sources and see what the actual text says. And I don't have any dog in the fight about whether there are really angels or demons or magic is real. I don't personally believe in any of it myself. But when someone asks me, like, do you think that you can really do curses on people? I'm like, you can do whatever you like. I don't think it's going to work. Yeah. But I'm not committed to any sort of supernatural worldview. And so, so it's great not to have a dog in the fight, because then I don't have to really care one way or the other about whether Paracelsus really could transform lead into gold. I'm like, I don't think he could. And so I don't have the need to, you know, to evangelize or be a guru about it. Thank God.
Yeah. Yeah. No, just to repeat that for everybody who's watching, you look very religious. Okay. I must admit, right? Many people would think that you're religious. But we've talked before, and our other interviews still on the Patreon. I haven't actually made it public yet. It hasn't made it out to the public. So anyone who's a Patreon member has already seen it. So there's this, this is your first time actually being on my channel.
Yeah, it's sort of funny that, I think that we've had a much other conversation that I guess hasn't made it out yet. But yeah, I think I look really religious, right? I have I wear the kippah because I think it's important, and I, you know, have a beard because it just whatever.
Right.
But I'm a Reconstructionist Jew, so I take my religion very seriously. I don't take supernatural stuff literally. So I'm not a theist. I don't think that there's some God out there that's choosing what days of the week I work. I take my tradition very seriously, but I don't take it literally. And so I belong to. For folks who out there who may know, I'm a follower of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who developed what is now called Reconstructionist Judaism, who says that tradition should have a vote, but not a veto. And so I'm very much about taking my tradition very seriously, but also when it drifts into whatever insanity, I don't do that.
Yeah.
So
thank you.
So-
Yeah, no, I mean, you didn't have to say all this, but it's good to know. So shout out to everybody. Rosa Rule, first in line. Melody, second in line. James, fourth. And third, sorry. Robert's fourth. And then Sobek, good to see everybody here. Merrick, Robert, Sobek, thank you for the super sticker, my friend. I really appreciate the support. Moon Shoes is here. We're just getting down in here. I don't know how to pronounce your name, but thank you so much for being here. Doc Pleroma. All right. Looks like we got a question already. Scott Daniel, thank you for that super chat, my friend. What do you believe the true provenance of the Corpus Hermeticum is?
Yeah, so the Corpus of Medicum is a collection of 17 relatively short documents. And of course, there's other texts as well. There's a good bit of texts, Aesculapius. There's other Hermeticum that have survived. So basically what we have in the Corpus of Medicum is a mystical philosophical system that developed probably in Alexandria sometime around the turn of the Common Era. It seems to have flourished in the first few centuries of the Common Era and then probably went extinct 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. It survives primarily because Christians, some Christians, like Tanchus really is the person we're thinking of here, really like the Corpus of Medicum because they thought that it prefigured, it described Christ, basically. So they really liked it, at least like Tanchus did. Augustine hated it, and it survived. So what's the provenance of it? The provenance is that it's Alexandrian. It's almost certainly a form of highly syncretistic religious philosophy that developed primarily as a mode of combining some Egyptian elements, although the Egyptian elements are relatively muted, with a great deal of what we would call religious Middle Platonism, which is Middle Platonism is the philosophy that sort of combines Platonism and Stoicism, really. And so that philosophy, which of course Philo of Alexandria is probably the most famous example of Middle Platonism, it fused those two together and it formed what we think are esoteric communities in Alexandria. And those communities, it seems like, had some kind of initiatory scheme. In fact, some of the documents that have survived from the Corpus of Medicum, some seem to be at various layers of initiation. So, for instance, some of the Corpus of Medicum seems to be for probationers, people just coming in. And then we have some Corpus of Medicum texts found in the Nag Hammadi library, Codex 6, I believe. That's where all the weird stuff is, where Thunder Perfect Mind is, and the Plato's Republic, and it's the more non-Gnostic stuff in Codex 6, I believe. That there's a text there called the Discourse on the 8th and the 9th, and that text seems to be for initiates, maybe even high-level initiates. So the provenance is that it's Egyptian. It's largely it has some Egyptian elements, but almost exclusively, I would say, the dominant philosophical underpinnings are Middle Platonic in nature. But of course, this document had a huge impact later on, right? It's brought to Italy in the 15th century, and folks may know this, right? But it was thought to be so important that that Ficino had to put his translation of Plato on hold, right? He paused his translation of Plato to translate the Corpus of Medicum, because the belief at the time was that Hermes Trismegistus, the alleged author, was contemporary to Moses, maybe even more older than Moses, and therefore there was a source of primeval wisdom. And so Ficino translated it. All his translations bad. In fact, he never authorized it to be published, and it was still published. It's a bad translation, but it had a huge impact in the world of Christianity, and it basically propelled a completely new form of esotericism that goes directly into modernity in the form of contemporary occultism. So speaking of the Corpus Medicum, it's in here. Ficino's translation is in here. This is a little hermetic compendium printed in 1633 that contains at the very end I can
Is
flip
that
to
an
the end.
original right there?
Oh yeah, this is an original. So you can, I don't know if it'll zoom in, if it'll get the focus or not, but this is sections from the Corpus of Medicum actually.
Wow.
Here toward the end. Sorry, it's not really getting focus. Let me see if I can get it a little closer. It doesn't want to focus. Sorry, it's not want to focus. But anyway, so this is a copy of the Corpus of, among other things, the Corpus of Medicum, printed in the 17th century. So it's a neat little hermetic book.
That's neat, man. That's neat.
Yeah.
So as far as actually knowing who authored this, we wouldn't even dare try to touch that. We would just say there were obviously people inside of what, a mystery cult, would you say? And where do you think it stemmed from? Like, they're claiming this came all the way back from Moses, right? But in reality, when do you think this was probably written, in the BC area somewhere?
No, I think that from the philosophical ideas, we can see that it's echoing ideas that we see in philosophers, for instance, like Numenius and people like that. So we can see the very clear traces of Alexandrian Middle Platonism on the Hermetica. And I'm certain the influence did not go the other way. It wasn't like the Hermetica developed these ideas that influenced a whole bunch of philosophers. I think it went the other way for sure. But no, these ideas definitely don't go back much further than the turn of the Common Era. I don't think you're talking about even first century BCE ideas. And so, because Platonism changed pretty dramatically in the first few centuries before the Common Era, and we can see the later ideas being reflected in the Corpus of Medicum. But no, Hermes Trismegistus and that stuff, he didn't really exist. Not only that, but we can even tell that inside of the documents that have survived, there are competing ideas about what his teachings were exactly, and they don't agree. So we can see that there are tensions. Surprise, surprise, right? Like we can see this in early Christianity and whatever. It's people. People never agree about anything. You
mean rabbis didn't agree with each other?
Could you believe it? Yeah. Could you believe that a bunch of people?
No,
it's impossible. But don't you know? All Jews agree about everything. All the time, right?
That's why they have that saying, 2 Jews, 3 ideas. Duh.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like, Christians debated anything in the first few centuries of the Common Era. No, it wasn't like, it was all done and they figured it out and they walked up. They came to the Council of Nicaea, they shook hands and walked away, and it was over. So no, even in the Corpus of Medicum, even among Gnostics, there's not uniformity of belief, and you can even see that there are competing schools in these texts. So no, there's not like Hermes Trismegistus got a vision of God and then revealed it to his followers, and then we have Hermeticism. That's just not the way it developed. And there's also another side of Hermetic documents. So we talk about these as the philosophical Hermetica. There's a whole other group of literature called the technical Hermetica, which is primarily astrology and alchemy. And so it's also in the Alexandrian world around the turn of the Common Era that we also see the rise of astrology and alchemy as we would recognize them now too. And those are also attributed to our friend Hermes Trismegistus.
Wow, man.
The thrice blessed.
Thank you so much for that. All right, we're moving on to the next one, Doc Pleromonite. Now, I must fair warn you, some of these questioners do not blame me if they're heavy-hitting questions. Okay. It's just what we do here at MythVision. So,
sure.
All right, Doc Pleromonite, thank you for the support, my friend. And I will butcher this, but Hecalot, is that right? Hecalot.
Yeah.
Mysticism received traditions or ideas from ancient Gnostic sources, or maybe via Arabic intermediaries, puzzled by Jewish rationalism, Genesis with zero dualism, and no descriptions of a bisexual pleroma.
Okay, that second part is a little perplexing to me. So I'll try to answer the first part. Did the Hecalot mysticism receive traditions from Gnostic sources? Probably. Probably. I strongly suspect that there was that the cultural well that the Hecalot mysticism, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, I think they were all drinking from the same well. Basically, that was sort of the cultural milieu, and these ideas of mystical journeys. It's a very common idea in the ancient world, not unique to any religion, actually. Most religions had some version of this. Even in the hardcore rationalism of Parmenides, he literally described going to another realm to receive the truth from a goddess. So it's not even unique to religion. It happens in philosophy as well, as much as one can draw a distinction between those at this time. So I would say yes, that there is some interplay between what we might call Gnosticism and Hechelite mysticism. If you want to see a really clear example of where these ideas are probably cross-pollinating, is in the Book of Jude, which is one of these Gnostic texts that, because it's not in the Nag Hammadi library, doesn't get that much play for whatever reason. I don't know why it's not. It's late, but it's in the Bruce Codex, and that the Book of Jude describes very clearly palaces in the world of the archons with their camps and the names of their camps in a very similar way that we see in the texts like the Hechelot Rabbah and the Hechelot Zutarti, the greater and lesser Hechelot literature. Now, the idea of Arabic intermediaries, I would say no, because it's just the Arabic will come later. Hechelot mysticism is written centuries before Arabic becomes a language of that region. That's in the 7th and 8th century with the rise of Islam. So no, I would say that no. What I would say, however, is that we do see the impression of Hechelot mysticism on the New Testament, famously in Corinthians, where Paul says he knew a guy who went to the third heaven, right? He was caught up to a third heaven. That was probably Paul, and he's probably referencing him engaging in some form of Hechelot mysticism. And also the night journey of Muhammad, I think, has to be understood in something like the milieu of Hechelot mystical journey mysticism. So I think you have the cart before the horse. I think it's the Jewish mysticism coming early, and then the Arabic stuff coming much, much later.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much. Did we get that second part? Puzzle by Jewish rationalism. Genesis?
I'm not quite sure. Like, that there was zero dualism in the Genesis story. Is that maybe what they're?
Puzzled by Jewish rationalism, Genesis with zero dualism and no descriptions of a bisexual pleroma.
I'm not quite. I'm not quite sure what to make about the first part. I mean, dualism does enter into Judaism, but well after the Book of Genesis was written or redacted or whatever, in probably the 5th century BCE or something. That you get this Persian influence coming in, and probably the beginning around then, and then that you can see that Persian Zoroastrian influence in a more dramatic way, for instance, in the rise of Jewish apocalypticism. But that's still centuries. That'd be centuries after the composition of the Book of Genesis, as much as the Book of Genesis is one book. It's a more of a tapestry or a quilt, I think, than a book. Being a Southerner, I think in quilts, and so I think about I think of the Torah as sort of like a quilt, and it's a lot of patches pieced together. And if you read Hebrew and see this, if you can see it from the sources, it looks a lot more like a quilt than it does a sheet. So,
thank you for that. Appreciate that, Doc. Dan Jacobs, appreciate the super chat. How much of a departure was the Zohar, and then Lurianic Kabbalah? Is it Kabbalah?
Yeah, Kabbalah. I'm sure you mean Kabbalah. Yeah.
Okay. Lurianic Kabbalah from historic Jewish mysticism, and where do these new ideas come from?
All right, this is a great question. So, how much of a departure was the Zohar and then Lurianic Kabbalah from? It is a complete radical departure. The writers of the Zohar, there were probably more than one, but Moshe de Leon being the central writer. Now, let's be careful here. On the one hand, yes, the Zoharic literature is a dramatic departure in many ways, theosophically, from previous forms of Jewish mysticism. And the two that are coming to mind here are the mysticism around the text Sefer Yetzirah, which is a theosophical text about the mechanisms by which God made the world, and speculations around language and ontology. That's one form of mysticism that existed. The other is Hechelot mysticism, we just mentioned. Now, to be clear, the Zohar incorporates both of those. There's brand new Sefer Yetzirah style speculation in the Zohar, and there's Hechelot text sections of the Zohar too. So the genius of the Zohar is to innovate and absorb. That's always the unique genius, right? Genius is never a decisive break. It's always the ability to innovate and absorb at the same time. And that's part of the great genius of Christianity, I think. Mm-hmm. The ability to be protean and not give up things.
It's literally a model that works in biology. I mean, evolutionary. They say the survival of the fittest, right? People think the strongest survive. No, the quickest to mutate and adapt to the new environment is obviously going to be the best that survives. And I think the same goes. We use that model in this.
Yeah, being adaptable is the key to survival and thrival, and I think that's true of creatures and true of ideas, because I mean, ideas keep the creatures alive too. And so, yes, in many ways, the Zohar is a dramatic break. It's a very big break. Now, and I say that because at the time when it came out, it was very controversial. It wasn't like the Zohar was immediately heralded with open arms by the Jewish community. It was highly controversial. It still remains decisive in some ways. But it's not as if the Zohar came out of nowhere. And this is a sort of a weird idea that sometimes people have that, like, I don't know, Crusaders or the Templars or whatever conspiracy theory people you like, the Cathars or something, they broke into an underground vault in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and found some scrolls, and now there's it was a Zohar or something. That didn't happen. We can see the ideas of Jewish mysticism. We can see the ideas of Kabbalah developing over centuries. And it's not until those ideas develop, primarily in the 1270s, actually, where we can see, oh, yeah, these ideas are now coalescing in a group of people in what is now the Castile region of Spain over there in Leon. And they begin to work together to generate the Zohar as we know it. And so it's not like it comes out of whole cloth, but we see it developing. And it really wasn't until the Alhambra decree in 1492, where Jews were expelled from Spain, that there's a spike in Messianism, because you get exiled from your home, you really hope someone's going to fix it. So the Messiah. And also you see there's a shift in that Messianism toward publication and making the Zohar more public. And this leads to all kinds of disastrous results with people like Shabbatai Tzvi and things like that.
This also shows up, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, this also is the jab at Gentiles, where there's this constant, like, if Jews who are coming against people who are non-Jews because of their persecution.
Yeah, I mean, some of that does exist in the Zohar. I mean, the Zohar is very hostile to non-Jews. It has a very negative attitude toward non-Jews, and it has a lot to do with the tensions, the social tensions that existed in Castile at the time. Jews were. It wasn't like the Alhambra decree came out of nowhere. They were facing as the Christians took back over. As much as there were glory days of Spanish of Islamic rule and Al-Andalus, which I think that stuff gets really overstated. Actually, it wasn't certainly no wonderful classical age and everything was perfect. But the Christians certainly began to turn the screws, and the situation in Spain deteriorated rapidly. And yeah, there was a lot of anti-Christian, anti-non-Jewish sentiment in the Zohar. So the where do these ideas come from? They come from internal to the Jewish community. It's the absorption of Neoplatonism into Judaism. It's the absorption of some ideas from Maimonides, but also really rejecting ideas from Maimonides. Moshe de Leon, for instance, one of the principal writers of the Zohar, actually had a copy of the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides, copied out for him. It survives. It's actually in Moscow. And so he intimately knew Jewish rationalism in the form of Maimonides and rejected it. And in many ways, that rejection becomes in some ways the Zohar, right? So Maimonides says, hey, God doesn't have a body, and anyone who says that God has a body is a blasphemer. Well, screw you. Not only does God have a body, we're going to intimately describe God's body. And it's going to be the Sphirot, the system of emanations that we get from sort of Jewish Neoplatonism. So we can see the ideas develop, and they don't come out of nowhere. They come out of very clear things in Jewish history and Jewish intellectual history. It just so happens that most people, they know the Kabbalah, but they don't know the other currents that are happening in the Jewish world at the time. And because they don't know those other currents, it looks like the Zohar just pops out of nowhere. But that's just not how any ideas happen. So it was a decisive break. And I would even say that Lurianic Kabbalah is a decisive break even with the mysticism of the Zohar. The Zohar's mysticism is very different than Lurianic Kabbalah. And we know that, for instance, because there were two competing schools of Kabbalah, the Cordoveran school, which was a systematization of the Kabbalah, and the Lurianic Kabbalah, which was its own thing in many ways. And they were at loggerheads for a generation until eventually the Lurianic Kabbalah absorbed the Cordoveran Kabbalah and, again, adapted and changed it. So so much so that I think basically no one reads Moshe Cordovero anymore. I'm like the one holdout that does not like Lurianic Kabbalah. I like Cordoveran Kabbalah as much as I believe in any of it, which I don't believe in any of it. It's just more intellectually attractive to me. Same reason I like Thomas Aquinas. But it lost. And so now when people say Kabbalah, they mean Lurianic Kabbalah almost exclusively.
Thank you so much for that. Doc
Yeah.
is back. Appreciate the support, my friend. Thoughts on the concept of God's kavod as first articulated in Ezekiel's being the model of the Gnostic anthropos, the son of man in Jewish apocalypticism, and the heavenly man in Pauline theology.
Yeah, so this is so the kavod is God's glory, and what we have beginning around the time of the writing of Ezekiel, but certainly later. Ezekiel is hard to pin down because he seems like he was just crazy, um, like a genius, but also like maybe he was off his rocker too. It's hard to say. But what ends up happening is that there are two ideas that that undergo what we in philosophy use a $4 word for, hypostatization. Right, hypostatization. It just means they become their own distinct entities. And two of those things that become their own distinct entities around that time are, one, God's kavod, God's glory, becomes a kind of it becomes a distinct entity, sometimes an angel. Metatron is often associated with the kavod Hashem, the kavod of God, and the other is the Shekhinah, the presence of God. And sometimes this is associated with God's wisdom. And you see that section in Proverbs where wisdom becomes sort of she becomes a hypostasized kind of entity. And so what ends up happening is that that tradition of God's kavod becoming hypostasized, becoming a kind of being unto itself, gets legs. And it gets legs to the point in which, when it meets up with Greek philosophy, they equate it with the logos, right? This is ideas already going on in Greek philosophy about this sort of intermediate being between the world and the unknowable one. There's an intermediate being called logos, and you see this in Stoicism. And that logos being is responsible for the creation of the world. Well, as people in the Second Temple period are tracking these ideas on top of each other, you have Jewish and Greek philosophers trying to map their ideas onto each other. And when it ends up getting mapped is the kavod and the logos. And you can see that in the book of John. That's the very beginning of the book of John, is that mapping really clearly mapped out, with the son being the logos.
Or in Philo, right? Philo does something to the effect.
Right. Philo, and that's part of the reason why Philo survives, is because they really liked the logos stuff, because basically they thought he was sort of doing Christian theology, at least according to them, according to Christians, without knowing he was doing it, kind of. But he's just echoing ideas coming from Middle Platonism and Stoicism. So what ends up happening is this kavod logos thing just gets its own legs and eventually becomes a distinct entity, almost to the point, well, not almost, to the point in which it becomes a kind of separate god. In fact, even in the Enochic literature, this entity is sometimes referred to as Yahweh Katan, the little Yahweh, which is it's like, I think of the baby Jesus or something, like the little Yahweh. But this entity Metatron gets called Yahweh Katan, to the point in which this develops into bitheism. And one of the heresy that Judaism worries about more than any other heresy in the Babylonian Talmud and in the literature around the Second Temple period, is not Christianity. Christianity does not bother rabbinical Judaism. They just don't care about it. What they are really concerned about is bitheism. And the most famous story in the entire Babylonian Talmud about this is where Elisha ben Abuya goes into the Merkava, goes into the Hechalot, goes into the palace of God, and he sees Metatron sitting on the throne of God and declares there are two deities. And that's the worst heresy recorded in the entire Talmud. He's the arch heretic, Elisha ben Abuya. So much so that his name just gets erased and he's called Acher, the other one. Like he just gets erased him anyways. So you just see it happen over and over again, right? You can see it in Paul, right? You can see it in Christian theology with the eventual divinization of Jesus. You can see it in other kinds of Gnostic texts, right, where we have this sort of divine, perfect man. And of course, you can also see it in Kabbalah with the so-called Adam Kadmon, which is this supernal, quasi-divine, Adamic character that sort of is almost like the Platonic form of human beings before human beings are instantiated in this world as a kind of maybe mistake, maybe not. Depends on how you read those texts. But yeah, this idea has enormous impact. It's one of these ideas that I don't understand why everyone doesn't know about it, because it's basically responsible for, it's the intellectual architecture behind at some level Trinitarian economics. You just can't get the Trinity off the ground without that intellectual infrastructure.
This is the same problem that this is why I'm absolutely loving what you're saying, by the way. Exactly how you just spelled it out with one example of most people take for granted the concepts and ideas they already have without knowing the evolution behind what impacted that to happen. And I'll give you an example and we'll move to the next super chat, but I just want to like give you, but mostly our audience to see, I've engaged with this group for a very long time. I'd say multiple years now, called Israel Only. Their whole idea is that Paul's Gentiles in the New Testament are literal apostatized Israelites because they can't fathom that a non-Israelite could sin because the law was only given to Israel. So they have this like harmonization method and they find passages in the Hebrew Bible and they want to bring continuity and say that they can't be pagans. They have to be Israelites somehow. And I just pulled the book out this morning, actually, because I was actually contacting Cattell Berthelot, Jews and the Roman Rivals. And this entire book, she shows the impact of the Roman, pagan Rome before Christianity had on Jews and their thinking. Long story short, they had the concept of adoption. There are a lot of things that started to impact how Jews viewed the non-Jews. While they saw Rome as an enemy, they also saw Rome as kind of a competitor and also a sibling. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. And while they were siblings, there was animosity between certain groups of Roman Jews, or mainly certain groups of Jews with Rome. The ideas impacted them to a point where now they're starting to interpret their scriptures a bit differently and go, all these Romans, these pagans want to convert, proselytize. So how do they go about praying? And that you find this down in the Mishnah and the Tosefta and stuff like that, where they're like, okay, Rabbi, this person wants to convert, but they want to say the prayer. Can they say the prayer, the God of our fathers? And the rabbi would go, no. They can say the God of your fathers because they're not descendants of Abraham. And then another rabbi comes on and goes, have you read the scriptures? Abram's name was changed to Abraham, the father of many goyim. Right. So the concepts, the words, the language, everything has changed and evolved. And if we're not tracking that evolution, we won't know why non-Israelites claim to be Abraham's descendants. Yeah. They weren't literally, but these ideas change. So that's the point I think is relevant to just pointing that out.
No, absolutely. It's certainly the case that yeah, I mean, also the Jews weren't a monolithic group of people. Right. I mean, we know from Josephus that some people were really pro-Roman, some people were really anti-Roman, and that goes back to even pre that with people forget that the Maccabean Wars were not so much wars against the Greeks; they were wars against Hellenizing Jews. Of course, we'd like to tell the story in a different way, but if you read the text carefully, the Maccabees really, really hate Hellenizing Jews. They're not so much against the Greeks. And so, yeah, there's a huge amounts of tectonic changes going on in Judaism around the time of the Second Temple. And of course, after it, the tectonic changes don't stop because there's no temple. And now they have to figure out what to do now. Mm-hmm. But I would say that, yeah, if you don't understand the intellectual world that is brewing around all this, for instance, the world of Middle Platonism, which no one studies Middle Platonism. No one, aside from Philo of Alexandria, no one's ever heard of Eudorus or Numenius or Ammonius Saccas and Athenodorus of Ascalon or whatever. No one cares about these. These are minor characters in history of philosophy where you can get a PhD in philosophy like I did and never hear about them.
Wow.
But these are the guys, this is the world, right, that is developing the ideas that in many ways, early Christianity, Judaism, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, they all rely on these ideas. And so jeez. I would challenge people that, and a great book about this, if folks want to pick it up, it's a little expensive, but it's really good, is John Dillon's book, Middle Platonism. It's the definitive sort of intellectual history of Middle Platonism. And I think that if you just don't have a grasp of the intellectual world of what's going on at that time, you can't really get these ideas don't make a lot of sense. And it's really funny because often people will think, oh, it's Neoplatonism, right? We need to study Neoplatonism. Well, that's a mid-3rd century intellectual development that
I've been saying that, and that's been a mistake. I don't know. That's see, I'm glad you're correcting me here. What is the author's name again?
John Dillon. He's famous. He's a big philosophy guy. Dillon. Thank you. But his book, Middle Platonism, is fantastic. I actually have it literally right here. I'm about to teach I'm teaching a class on Hermeticism and the Middle Platonists. This is just, it's thick. This is a no joke book. This is a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I think that, I think that we often do ourselves a disservice by not getting the intellectual foundations right, because I see all kinds of weird things where people are like, oh, it's Neoplatonism that's responsible for whatever, the Trinity.
Hmm.
I know the Trinity is already being developed in Justin Martyr, and that's Middle Platonism. Justin Martyr is 200 years out almost from Plotinus. So it's like weirdly anachronistic philosophical thinking,
Wow.
as if Plotinus can reach back in time and affect Justin Martyr somehow. It doesn't work that way intellectually, for sure.
Thank you. Crossover Maniac. Good to see you here, and thank you for the super chat. Between the cremation of care ritual and spirit cooking, is it really out of the question that the rich and powerful practice the occult in secret?
If they do practice the occult in secret, they're doing a pretty good job of keeping it secret. I don't have any evidence personally that there's some big conspiracy of the rich and the powerful practicing the occult. And the reason why I think that is, how to say this without being flippant. Let's say that magic were real. Let's just go with that for a second, right? Let's say that magic were real. If it were real, it would be a branch of the military. We'd have the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and the magicians. Because the government would be using it, Google would be using it, everyone would be using it to manipulate reality to get what they want. I mean, if you could throw fireballs and curse people, why wouldn't Vladimir Zelensky be hiring all the magicians he could to do whatever?
Mm-hmm.
What that tells me is that because no one seems to get it to work, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And I think that people who are rich and powerful, one, being rich and powerful doesn't make you smart. I mean, Ronald Reagan, for instance, had his own court astrologer. I don't think he made any better or worse decisions because of his astrologer. So I don't think it works, for one. And two, it would seem to me that people like, I don't know, Elon Musk or something, they just have very little time for like cockneyed stuff that doesn't work. I think there's a question I think Elon Musk asks you when you go to apply to work at Tesla or whatever. He asks you, like, what is the most complicated technical challenge you've ever solved? And I think if someone came in and said, oh, I had a problem and I solved it with magic, he's going to be like, yep, you're not getting a job. So I don't know. I think that there's an idea that it's a conspiratorial belief that somehow the rich and the powerful get their riches and power through occult powers. I think the stock market's a pretty good way of getting a lot of money. I think that, inventing super fancy cars and whatever. And so, Bohemian Grove and stuff like this, that people think that there's some kind of vast conspiracy. I think it's just a bunch of like rich people dicking off in the forest and getting drunk and having sex and stuff. I just don't see any evidence of occult powers. And again, I think that people, I'm going to say this again. If you read these books like I do, like I read these books, like, I read books about black magic all the time, how to summon demons. Some of these books have the silliest stuff in it. For instance, there's a book called The Sacred Magic of Abramelin. It's supposed to be the most technically complicated, intense magical practice one can do, right? It's sort of the gold standard of hardcore magic. It tells you how to like summon magical monkeys to play music for you. I'm like, is that what rich people are up to? With like powerful magic, summoning magical monkeys to play music for them? And if you talk to occultists, and I know plenty of occultists, and I always ask them about the monkey section, and they're like, yeah, we don't really talk about the monkey section because that's silly. And I'm like, the person who wrote that book thought it was serious enough to put it in there.
Yeah.
So
he had a monkey fetish.
Yeah, they're big into monkeys, and I guess it would be cool to have some monkeys come play like Led Zeppelin songs for you. Or
that
something.
Would be cool.
Yeah. I would pay money to see a monkey Led Zeppelin cover band or whatever. But I'm fairly confident that rich and powerful people, they got better things to do.
I think you did a really good job of explaining that. And no matter what, some of them are thinking you're probably getting paid by them just to say that. So that's
I wish I were.
I know that's the level of
you're like part of it, man.
Yeah, you're
you're just part of the Jewish conspiracy controlled by the Zionist
oh my gosh.
Rothschild occultists. And I'm like, man, trust me, if I could be part of some vast conspiracy, I wouldn't be on YouTube asking for Patreon, buddy. Like,
yeah, for real.
I'd get my check from the vast conspiracy of occultists, and I would be like, out. I'm gonna go kick it in Paris.
That's part of the whole conspiracy, don't
Exactly,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
We got to keep that between us.
Yeah.
Gnostic informant Neil, thank you so much for the super chat.
Neil, I'll see you
Dr.
Sunday, brother.
Sledge, yeah, good to see him.
Yeah.
Dr. Sledge is a treasure. Love that these conversations are taking place.
Yeah.
Go
Thanks, Neil,
subscribe
man.
to my boy Neil. Yeah, go
Yeah.
subscribe.
Yeah, Neil's great. I'll see him. We're chatting on Sunday night. So, folks,
Is that going to be live?
I think it's going to be live. And I
Ooh.
think so. Yeah, I think so. So, yeah, I think we're going to. So you can get more occulty esoterica stuff. Bring your hard-hitting questions about what conspiracy I'm allegedly involved in now. I got to start playing it up, Derek. I really got like.
You should.
I just like come in, just like do weird stuff. Like,
just start.
Yeah, just like
Whatever
the Illuminati stuff.
Yeah, isn't that what Jim Carrey did that, and everyone
Yeah.
had a hoop, blah, whatever.
Yeah,
So
yeah, part of the Illuminati.
yeah. Do you? I see it.
Yeah.
Do you see it?
Yeah, I can. My third eye.
Avaros, good to see you here, my friend. Thank you for the super chat. What's your view on Deuteronomy 32, Divine Council of Gods?
Oh, it's interesting you would pick Deuteronomy 32 and not some of the great stuff in the Psalms about the Divine Council. I think Psalm 82, I think it's, if I remember correctly, 82, 83, I can't, whatever.
It's in the 80s.
It's in the 80s, yeah. And you know, just throw a hand grenade in there, you'll get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very clear that the religion of the Israelites was Canaanite religion. The Israelites emerged out of Canaan. They weren't come from Egypt or whatever. Some people came from somewhere and brought Yahweh, and that's an imported god. But the pre-Yahweh religion of ancient Israel was the Canaanite religion that we know a good bit about from Ugaritic texts. For instance, the texts recovered from Rosh Hashanah. And in those texts, we see clearly there's a divine council.
Yeah.
We see a divine council in those texts, and it's clear from the earlier stratas of Israelite literature that what we have is El, right? And that's pre-El being fused with Yahweh. We have El, and beneath him is a retinue of entities. And he may have had a consort as well. There's some debate about the Asherah business from Kuntalit or Judah or whatever. But this subsection of beings that existed would include the Satan. It would include other kinds of. It probably include some of his messenger beings. And it's really clear that when we have El talking, he's talking to someone. It's not the royal we. It's a weird importing weird medieval European ideas onto an ancient Near East text. It's like stupid. That's just not how that stuff worked. He's talking to somebody, and he's talking to other members of the Divine Council. And we can see, for instance, my favorite story in the Hebrew Bible is with Ahab, where Yahweh, God wants to kill Ahab, and what he does is he speaks to basically his Divine Council and says, "Look, I want someone to become a lying spirit and go into the prophets and lie to Ahab to go get him killed." And one of the spirits volunteers to do it and does it. And so it's clear that there's these sons of God, right? You see those also in Genesis, right? And I think that literally they were sons of God. I think that they're in the same way that El had sons in the form of the Rephaim, for instance, in Ugaritic literature. I think the Israelites thought just like that because they were Canaanites.
I mean, yeah, it's pretty obvious, but yeah, I think Avaros also agrees. I haven't talked to him about this, but he is a friend of mine as well. I think we're 100% on the same page. What really gets me in that Deuteronomy 32 part, though, just to make one comment, we have a crap ton of super chats I got to get through.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I just wanted to make this point that was interesting is that Israel was Yahweh's inheritance. And the way I think of inheritance is I have parents, and one day they'll leave an inheritance. I will leave an inheritance to my kids. If Yahweh is the chief supreme and nobody's above, then why is Israel his inheritance?
Right.
Unless something is being given to him by a deity above. I wonder if this is somehow still slipping through the pantheon idea that Israel is an inheritance. Here you go. You are just one of the many sons of El. But that they later fuse. Anyway,
and you get that fusion takes a long time, and you can see the slow process of that fusion. Where it's clear that Yahweh is sort of one God among lots of gods that the Israelites could have picked up. Although they did diminish after the Bronze Age collapse, you'd sort of get a much lower count of gods, and by that time, Anat and El and a few others, Baal.
Thank you so much. Aaron Adair, good to see you here, my friend. We're going to be doing a show next week, by the way. Is there a distinction between magic and sympathetic magic? Is there a metaphysics of magic not based on analogy metaphor?
This is a great question. So sympathetic magic, for folks who don't know what that's referring to, is the idea that the world is bound together with sympatheos, which is just the Greek idea that things that are alike share some kind of metaphysical relationship. So folks probably know, for instance, the color of the moon and silver, the metal silver. The ancients thought that the color of silver and the color of the moon were so much alike that they must be somehow metaphysically related to each other. And red, Mars, and so we get these kind of sympathetic relations all through nature. And the idea in sympathetic magic is that by manipulating one object, you can manipulate the other object, because they're like begets, or like manipulates like. And so the idea is that if you, and I'm sure folks have seen like sympathetic magic, where you can take a doll that looks like someone and you get some of their hair and you do nasty stuff to it, right? Voodoo dolls. Mm-hmm. That's an example of sympathetic magic. So that is a very popular form of magic. Sympathetic magic is a very popular form of magic that existed and throughout the entire ancient Near East and exists up until now. I would say it's probably the dominant form of magic in many ways. By the way, that idea of sympathy comes from Stoicism. Again, this is another example where an idea has entered into popular ideas or magic or whatever, but actually has its origins in a philosophical school, specifically Stoicism. I think it's Posidonius that developed that idea. I would have to check to make sure, but I think it's Posidonius who was the third scholar of the Stoic school. At any rate, no, there are other non-sympathetic forms of magic. Necromancy is a pretty common form of magic, right? This is contacting the dead for various kinds of things. You can to learn the future.
What about blood magic? What about the idea that the Israelites had to sacrifice, spilling blood? In a sense, is there some sympathetic magic there that, well, we have blood as well, and because we have blood, if we take the blood of that animal, that somehow purges us of, like a Scientologist, what do they call those things? Thetans.
The Thetans that you have to get released. They're dead aliens that have clung to your body.
Right. Rather than getting all sci-fi in a weird way, isn't this also the mindset of the sin?
I think that at least in terms of sacrifice, a lot of that is the idea that you're giving life for life. And in many ways, animal sacrifice is often a substitution for human sacrifice. And you can see in many cultures where, for instance, in sieges, child sacrifice becomes increasingly common, because the gods because you're under siege, you really have to up the ante, and sacrificing children typically is the way that the ante gets upped. But yeah, I think that that there's a like and like, blood and blood, life and life relationship there. But yeah, I think that there are other forms of magic that that existed. Divination is another form of magic that existed in the ancient world, still exists. So I would say there are many forms of magic that are not based on analogy and metaphor. However, I think that the dominant form of magic in the ancient world, and probably now in many ways, is sympathetic in character, which is to say you're attempting to manipulate occult forces through relations of sympathy. Alchemy works that way. Lots of things work that way. Now, if you folks ever seen forms of magic that involve like what's the name of that root? I grew up with it, and the old timers in the South would use it, and now it's not ginseng. Whatever root it is, there's a root that kind of looks like people, and they would often use it. They put it in milk, for instance, under cribs and things to help to get pregnant, because the idea is that it's a mandrake root. It looks like a person, and so you get these sort of sympathetic relations. Or the bulbs of some plants are often used to the magical things to heal erectile dysfunction, because they look like testicles.
Right. There's this like connecting dots in a way that you wouldn't typically today. We compartmentalize, unlike in those days. So sorry for me having to cover my mouth. My wife just called, and I have a medical emergency happening with my son. Just to give everybody in the audience and you a little, he had an earache. We went down to the beach to get away during all these tough times last week. Mm-hmm. He got an earache, and so he started having a fever 2 days ago. And so we've been giving him Tylenol, trying to break it. Finally, yesterday we took him into like one of those quick fast med places to get him antibiotics and stuff. And then my wife took him to the hospital today because he's still not right. Right now, she just called me and I put it on speaker, but I didn't want to interrupt. And so there's some big name for it. But if they're going to do a CT scan and see what's going on, I don't know what's going on. But if it's bad, they'll have to hospitalize him.
Oh, my goodness.
And so everybody who's super chatted, I want to get through these because I have no transportation anyway. I'd have to wait for her to come and get me or get a ride. But I'd like to get through your super chats, please. No more super chats if you don't mind, just because I don't want to leave anyone hanging. And let's get through this. I'm very sorry in the middle of this live stream, but I also have
Derek,
to take care of.
No,
what's
absolutely,
Derek.
And no, please just do whatever you got to do to take care of your child, man. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Let's get through these. She called me and she said that she's coming home to get me. So I have like 15, 20 minutes before she gets here. And this was one of my concerns this morning. He didn't look very well at all. And so,
well, I hope what we say is reflua shlema, complete healing for your
I hope
son.
so.
Yeah.
I'm really worried about that. Yeah. So
we can totally time it. We can come back. We can keep the super chats, time it, and you can go, man. I don't want you to feel any pressure.
She's on her way here anyway. Okay. I just want to get through these. If you don't mind, I don't like to leave anybody hanging. And if we don't mind, so Avros, what were the unwritten doctrines of Plato?
Great. So, so Plato alludes to the fact that he's not telling us the whole story, and in his dialogues, and also there's a famous section in the letter 7. Where he says that you can't tell the whole story, the whole philosophical story. So we were fairly confident that Plato had unwritten doctrines. These are sometimes called the agrapha dogmata, the unwritten doctrines. And what we think they were some kind of mathematical esotericism, probably Pythagoreanism of some variety. We think that because the kinds of ideas that you see in Plato, if you read the Republic or read Platonic works, the kinds of ideas that are being wrestled with in the Platonic works, which are published and made available to the public, are nothing like the ideas that you see Plato's inheritors dealing with, Xenocrates and Speusippus. Xenocrates and Speusippus, Speusippus was Plato's nephew. They're dealing with weird mathematical mysticism. And what we think is going on is that the ideas in Speusippus and Xenocrates are actually probably the unwritten doctrines, or them working out some of the problems in the unwritten doctrines of Plato. So we're fairly confident, I won't say that, we have reason to believe that they have to do with some type of mathematical mysticism, probably some version of Pythagoreanism.
Okay. Gregory Bloomfield, I love listening to Dr. Justin. He is a great treasure of history or historical and occult knowledge. I could listen to him speak 24/7.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Growing Pains, thoughts on Kuzari principle and the claim that the oral Torah was transmitted at Mount Sinai and especially national revelation.
I'm not sure what the Kuzari principle is. That's like I'm not sure what the Kuzari, like in the book by the book by Yehuda. I don't know. The claim that the oral Torah was transmitted at Mount Sinai. I don't have a dog in the fight. I think the rabbis made it up, but I think all religions made up. So I don't really have. I think that pious fraud is pious and fraud. And I think that in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, the rabbis had to sort something out. And I think that no religion can operate with just dogmatic ideas written down. You have to have some way of doing them. And the example I give to people is, imagine a situation where someone who had no idea how to celebrate the 4th of July asked you how to celebrate the 4th of July. We all know how to do it, right? But if someone asked you, do you have to shoot fireworks on the 4th of July to have successfully celebrated the 4th of July? And so I think that what you have to do is, when you ask someone how to do something and they try to explain it, they're going to develop oral traditions about how to explain it. And those developed over the centuries in Judaism, and they become enshrined in rabbinical Judaism as sort of authoritative and come from Mount Sinai. Do I think they came from Mount Sinai? No, because I don't think there really was a God on Mount Sinai telling a bunch of people in the desert what to do and what not to do. I think that's part of national mythology, and it's a mythology that's very important to me. But mythology just the same.
Thank you so much for answering that. Susie Bailey, good to see you here with the super sticker. I seriously appreciate you. Neophyte One, thank you for the super chat. Dr. Sledge, was there a magical connotation associated with the Lord's name that the commandment against using the Lord's name in vain meant to curb?
Probably. Yeah, probably. I strongly suspect that many gods and many beings often undergo what we call taboo replacement. And people know this too, right? When people say things like Jesus H. Christ or Jiminy Cricket or whatever, what you're doing there is you're taking a divine name and you're subbing in something to undergo taboo replacement. Many ancient peoples, for good reason, I think, believed that the power of language was magical and that the names of their gods held significant power. Today, even to this day, right? Pious Jews won't attempt to pronounce the divine name. They'll say Adonai or Hashem or whatever. So this idea, I think, is very ancient. And so I think that this idea of using the Lord's name in vain is a weird translation for what the Hebrew there is. And I think it probably had to do with using it in magical means that were non-sanctioned. There were sanctioned means to use it, but I think the idea was to prevent it from being used in non-sanctioned ways. And it's really important to understand this about magic in the Hebrew Bible, is that the supernatural causation isn't forbidden in the Hebrew Bible. There's just certain types of supernatural causation that are forbidden. So divination per se isn't forbidden. It's just that you can't do certain kinds of divination. If you can do divination, you just have to do it through the Urim and Thummim. You can't do it through the dead. And so it's really important to note that the Hebrew Bible is picky about what you can and can't do, but it doesn't carte blanche prohibit stuff. At least not in that way. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Thank you for the super chat. Again, another one. I seriously appreciate it. Stop Scamming Man says, when people give hyper metaphorical takes on what the founders of religion supposedly meant, I'm concerned that they are being dismissive how much people of old believed in the supernatural and magic.
Okay. It's not so much of a question, but yeah, I think that I think that people probably in the early Iron Age and Bronze Age really did believe their gods lived on mountains in the sky. I mean, I've seen mountains and I could believe that there are gods up there. I mean, if I didn't have a modern worldview, it would seem very obvious to me that powerful beings made all this and live in the sky. So yeah, I think that that's the case. I think it's interesting about who gets to decide what's a metaphor and what's not. That's an interesting kind of hermeneutical power, like who gets to decide this is a metaphor and this isn't a metaphor. That God has a right hand or doesn't have a right hand. And you can see this, for instance, working itself out in Judaism, where there are hyper-literalists who really did believe that God had a hand and you can measure it. There's an entire form of mysticism based on measuring the dimensions of God's body called the Shi'or Koma mysticism. And then, of course, you have Maimonides comes out and says, absolutely not. God does not have a body. And if you try to imagine God at all, you're engaging in idolatry. So, yeah, I think that both have coexisted in monotheism for quite some time, and Christianity squares a circle with this because you get the distant divine Father, but you also get the Son that you can draw all day long. So you get the visual representation that I think most of us crave in our imaginations. We want to imagine something, and so you get your iconography. And even Christianity isn't super comfortable with that. I mean, the Protestants smashed a lot of great statues in the religious wars of the 16th century.
Thank you so much. Crawford, good to see you here. It's been a minute. Happy Friday, magical musical monkeys. Who'da thunk of that? Hi, Derek and Dr. Austin. Or Dr. Justin, sorry, I'm misreading. Thank you so much. Scott Daniel, how would you measure Dian Fortune's influence on modern occultism? I'm reading her works with a critical eye, and she seems less irrational than others.
So Dian Fortune, I think, has made a big impact on a certain understanding of Kabbalah, downstream in many ways of what sometimes gets called Hermetic Kabbalah. When you say modern, I would say contemporary. I think her impact has been primarily in the last 20 years, 20, 30 years. So yeah, it's a huge impact in the past 20 or 30 years, but it's a particular kind of Kabbalah that I think would be largely unrecognizable, maybe to some degree, to traditional Kabbalah. Often what occultists think the Kabbalah is and what religious Jews think the Kabbalah is are actually quite different things. Same word, but different under the hood.
Thank you so much for that. Crossover Maniac, I don't believe the occult has any real power, but that doesn't mean that they don't believe or it doesn't influence them. As an example, the Nazis' involvement in the occult is well documented.
I mean, when we say the Nazis, right, what we really mean is a very tiny section of the SS. The folks around Himmler, yeah, there were some folks around Himmler, and they were doing some weird Nazi stuff. And there were marginal figures in the Third Reich that were interested in occultism. Was the National Socialist German Workers' Party interested in occultism? No. I think Hitler had very little time for it. I think that the Wehrmacht had very little time for it. I think that there was some weirdos in the upper ranks of the SS that were interested in it. So I think that, again, I think we have to measure, we have to make sure that we're punching correctly, which is just to say that, we can overstate how much of an impact it had. And I think the impact was marginal in the national. I think the average rank and file Nazi was not doing rune magic. I think you get Heinrich Himmler and a couple of his weirdo buddies in that castle or whatever, trying to divine the future with people's heads or whatever the hell they were doing. But again, I think Heinrich Himmler in that way was a bit of an odd bird, even in the SS. When you're an odd bird in the SS, you've done it.
Yeah.
You're a weirdo among the bad. But it makes for good video games. Castle Wolfenstein.
Thank you so much, Crossover. Stop Scamming Man. Do you think the concept of Nefesh, Rauk, and Nashama influenced the idea of Trinity?
Probably not. So these are just different words for the soul that appear in various degrees in the Hebrew Bible. And it's not even clear, and even in the Hebrew Bible, that they've really even worked out the differences between these, assuming that there is much of a difference. And even in the Hebrew Bible, you see skepticism about whether this even survives death. Kohelet famously said, Ecclesiastes famously asks, does the ruach of a beast go into the earth, and the ruach of a man go somewhere else? It's a skepticism. So I don't think so. I don't think that these ideas for what we would call the soul and so much influence the idea of the Trinity. I think that's coming far more from Greek philosophy primarily than it is coming from Jewish, from at least these Jewish ideas. And the idea of the three souls, or in fact in Kabbalah you have up to five, that there are five different souls that can exist in a body. Plato had three, Kabbalah has five. You can pick a soul, any soul.
Thank you, Stop Scamming Man. How close is Middle Platonism to Plato's dialogue?
Time-wise, a couple centuries later. So Plato's writing in the 4th century. It's 2 centuries later we really see the rise of Middle Platonism. If you mean in terms of the philosophical works, unfortunately, not a lot of philosophical works have survived. Philo is being the biggest example of stuff that survived. But I would say that in terms of the metaphysics, it's pretty far removed. Middle Platonism has a very strong adjunct of Stoicism in it. And so that Stoic adjunct really gives it a very different feel than Plato. But we still have the forms, although I would say the forms are much more highly regulated. And even by the late Plato's still questioning the idea of the forms. The Parmenides very clearly makes it out that Plato's not totally sold on the forms as he's described in the Republic. So even Plato's changing his mind. Is there a form of hair, dirt, and mud? Is the famous one from the Parmenides?
Well, thank you so much for that. And Wade, thank you for that super chat. I do want everybody to know, please go support my guest by subscribing to his YouTube channel. And we got one more here. I'm sorry, I missed it. Neophyte 1 says, Dr. Sledge, it appears human sacrifice was common in many ancient religious systems. What is the magical significance and purpose of human sacrifice? And then after this one, I do need to go.
Sure. I would say that human sacrifice is meaningful because typically the way that this all works is that it's called do ut des, right? The Latin phrase means I give so that you give. And typically you have to give something of value to the gods in order to get something of value back. And what is the most valuable thing that one can give? People, loved ones, especially aristocrat people. And so I think that the purpose of it, as much as it was magical, but the purpose is simply as you want more and more from the gods, you have to give more and more to them. And typically, as that turns itself all the way up to 11, it becomes human sacrifice. It becomes human sacrifice. So I think that's the logic. And yeah, we see it in Incan society. We see it in Phoenician society. Probably existed in Israelite society to some degree. But yeah, it was ubiquitous, although I think rare, because again, sieges are the classic example where we see human sacrifice kick itself up. When people are under siege, that's when we often see human sacrifices actually being performed at much sieges and droughts, things like that.
Thank you so much. And don't forget, subscribe to his channel. Like I just showed you his YouTube videos. They're in the description. I'm sorry about this brief, abrupt end here. Let's do this again, Dr. Sledge. Seriously, I do want to make sure my son's okay and call my wife. He's terrified of needles. He's terrified of everything. And they're having to give him an IV right now.
Oh,
I don't know how much is going to go into this. And I was trying to like distract my mind because this is really a serious medical emergency. I got to find out. I thought it was just an earache, but no, it might be more. So please go check him out. Join his
take care of your son.
Yeah, I am. She just texted me how much longer, so I'm calling her now. Go check him out. Join his Patreon. Consider joining our Patreon. And with that being said, never forget, we are MythVision.
Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.